Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. My apologies for my inconsistency lately when it comes to watching and commenting on your videos and to posting videos of my own. But I come to you today with what I hope will be a relatively short one, a tag, the H tag, created by master tag producer Jim at Books, Reading, and Stuff. He's been making a complete series of tags based on the alphabet, starting with A and continuing from there. I think I've only managed to film A and B so far, but since H is a very special letter to me, I thought I would skip ahead and do this tag. On top of that, Jim was kind enough to tag me for this one, since my channel name also begins with H. Let's get right to the prompts. The first one is H is for Harry Potter. Would you prefer to travel to Hogwarts in a flying car or on the Hogwarts Express? Well, although I have a driver's license, I really don't drive at all these days due to effects of a medical issue. Driving on the road is hard enough, and navigating in a flying car sounds significantly more difficult. I'm very grateful for the public transportation option to Hogwarts. Luckily, I'm very fond of trains, too, so I'll be definitely on the Hogwarts Express. The next prompt, H is for horror. Why do kids love horror? I have no idea, do they? I certainly loved scary stories when I was young, full of ghosts and witches and the like, but I never liked when scary was combined with realistic gore, and I think that's a key part of horror fiction, right? I know so little about the genre that I'm really not the person to ask. On to the prompt number 3. H is for Hemingway. Hemingway or Fitzgerald. Actually, I'm rather fond of both. Fitzgerald is definitely my preferred choice here, but I think I like Hemingway more than a lot of people do in our corner of BookTube. Yes, I sometimes get annoyed by the way both of these authors portray women and gender relationships as a whole, but both authors have books that sit proudly on my shelves. Okay, next question. H is for hardback. Do you prefer hardbacks or paperbacks? To be honest, I like both. The majority of hardbacks I've read in my life are probably library copies. Still, when I get a brand new hardback, there's something really special about that reading experience. I still write in the margins with my pencil, but still, I love the way it feels in my hands. On to the next prompt. H is for Hardy. Which is your favorite Thomas Hardy novel? I've answered this question in a couple of different ways already on this channel, but for today, I'll name Return of the Native. As I mentioned relatively recently, I read all of Hardy's major novels, with the exception of Jude the Obscure, in a single white-hot week when I totally fell in love with the author. Tess was my first, and definitely one I love. Unlike most readers seem to feel, I like Far From the Madding Crowd least. And I think Return of the Native is the book that surprised me most. The characters have stuck with me, although the exact plot has not. The setting and the tone, though, have been even more lasting. I don't think a week goes by when I don't think about something somehow related to Hardy's novels. And next we come to the prompt, H is for hot. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, how are you coping with the heat? On all but the hottest days, I sit in my unair-conditioned day room with 2 separate fans blowing on me, drinking iced tea or cold seltzer all day. When the heat is at its worst, I hide in the bedroom, where my husband has his pandemic office set up. We have a room unit air conditioner in that room, and I try to make sure I set myself up in a corner that isn't visible when David has Zoom meetings. I'm not fond of the heat, I'm afraid, even though I grew up in the South. Maybe the 7th prompt, H is for Hunger Games. Do you prefer the Hunger Games or Harry Potter? I've never read the Hunger Games, so I guess I have to say Harry Potter. I've told this story before, but just in case you're new here, I'll tell it again. My spouse David and I read every book aloud to each other, even before we were reading them to our son. In fact, the first book of the Harry Potter series came into our house just a few days after Abe was born. For my very first outing after the home birth, we, of course, went to a bookstore, one with chairs everywhere, so I could spend a lot of time sitting down since I was still recovering from birth and holding our beautiful baby. That day, my husband did the browsing for me. On the front table of this local Barnes & Noble was a new release of a paperback I had never heard of, but which David knew all about. He picked it up, brought it home, and read me the first chapter aloud that same evening. After we finished the book, just a chapter or two a night usually, we would spend months and months waiting for the next book, always trying to figure out where the plot was going. We occasionally predicted the course of events, at least to a degree, but Rowling always went significantly further than we ever imagined. Personally, I liked the early books in the series far more than the later books. At some point, when Abe was old enough to understand what was going on, but not yet quite mature enough to hear their growing darkness, we had to read to each other after Abe had fallen asleep. Eventually, our son read each book to himself, one on each birthday, so he had to grow up while the fictional Harry was maturing. The first time he read one to himself might have been when he turned maybe 6 years old, I'm not sure. David and I stored the hardback volumes in our bedroom. Each year on his birthday, Abe would sneak into our room, grab the next volume, and read until lunchtime. What I remember most about the books is not the plot or even the characters, but all the family time we've spent reading and thinking about those books together. The next prompt is H is for honey. Pooh was addicted to honey. What is your sweet addiction? I'm not a huge fan of sweet things. I much prefer salt and fat. If you put popcorn or cashews or whatever in front of me, they will disappear. I'm also a sucker for hummus. I guess my very favorite sweet thing is probably a simple lemon-scented pound cake that my great-grandmother used to bake. A great-grandmother who died long before I was born, but passed on her recipes. And nevertheless is a woman I feel close to in some way because I was named after her. And of course, the name we share, the name in my channel's title, appropriately begins with H. Incidentally, that prompt starts with a reference to Winnie the Pooh, and I have a long and random Pooh story I can share sometime if anyone is interested. Anyway, on to the penultimate prompt. H is for The Handmaid's Tale. If you've read the book, what did you think of it? Please excuse me for getting nerdy here, or nerdier than usual. When I was in late college, I read Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative and a whole lot of other really powerful slave narratives, especially those by women, whether written themselves at the time or recorded much later as part of the Federal Writers Project during the Great Depression or whatever. So many of these narratives by formerly enslaved black women reference enforced sexuality and sexual violence. Around the same time I was focused on slave narratives, I read Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale and was really disturbed by what she was doing. As a Southern historian who read a lot about the experiences of enslaved women on white plantations, I began to feel that Atwood was turning history into fiction by turning victims from black women into exclusively white women. I recently heard someone call The Handmaid's Tale a deraced slave narrative, one that deraces in two ways. First, blacks are completely removed from the narrative and resettled by those in control of Gilead and, of course, by Atwood herself in another part of the country. The other deracing is because the story that Atwood constructs is a story that has been written before and lived before in somewhat startlingly similar ways by some of the African American women living in slavery. Here are women forcibly separated from their own children and made to live in the houses of wealthy men, but this time the story is made, well, quote, universal and neutral and colorblind. We can translate all those words into a much more obvious one. white. Instead of exploring how power and hegemony has actually worked and is still working in complex ways in history, we get a much simpler story, where race is erased or deraced, and the story is reclaimed and adapted by whites. On top of that, the reason for the oppression in Atwood's book is purely about gender, not at all about the politics of capitalism. Slavery was not just oppression motivated by racist assumptions. It was also very distinctly about making money. Economic motivations were enough that people could own other people and often not even imagine that what they were doing was wrong. The history of American slavery isn't complete without that link to capitalism. Read Ed Baptist's powerful book, The Half Has Never Been Told, if you need more convincing or want to understand the even larger picture. I've heard other people complain, including maybe Steve Donahue, that Atwood is just changing a few tales rather than creating a whole new science fiction world. What I'm talking about is not the change of a few details in her world building, but the change of a few details in her basic plot or premise. And those changes completely silence the people who actually lived through the history she's retelling, albeit in a fictional way. I read an article in the London Review of Books sometime maybe last year, which I filed away and just dug out. The article was about surrogacy and mentioned Atwood's novel. Here's what Jenny Turner says, which I think is a really interesting angle. Quote, "Imagine how much easier politics would be if the only thing standing in the way of peace and harmony was, as she put it, evil religious fundamentalist with guns. You wouldn't need to worry about capitalism or racism or your own complicity in both or either." So yes, I've read The Handmaid's Tale. I don't hate everything Atwood writes by any means, but this one is not my favorite. Anyway, let's go on from there. The final prompt is a really interesting one, giving us a chance to talk about art for a second. H is for Hopper. What are your thoughts on the works of Edward Hopper, the American painter? I do like Hopper's work, but I don't love it. I find the exactness and stillness of his work to be a bit off-putting. I suppose that's part of the point, his desire to show alienation, or at least loneliness. I suppose there's a little something related to Thomas Hardy, actually. Not the precision, but the foreboding sense of isolation. Two American painters whose work I saw a couple of weeks ago were Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock. And for the first time, I realized that although Rothko created these smooth and quietly absorbing canvases, and Pollock created these kinesthetic paintings that always feel chaotic, there's something rather similar about their work. Both are creating these utterly non-narrative works with no real focal point. What we get is the whole. I know very little about the art of their time and place, or about them as people, and I'd really like to learn more. Well, that's it for today's video. Thank you so much, Jim, for creating this great tag and for tagging me. Even though I'm so behind on your alphabet series, I do hope I can catch up before the end of the year. And thanks to all of you for joining me today for this video here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.